Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Todd Sears, and I'm the founder and CEO of Out Leadership, which is the first and only global LGBT business organization. AJ, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about the sexual orientation and gender identity dimension of diversity. Now, for many people, LGBTQIA+ can be a mouthful and a challenge, and quite often misunderstood. The first thing that we should think about is the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. And if you think about it in that way, the first few letters of the acronym, lesbian, gay, bisexual, define someone's sexual orientation. That is who they are attracted to in the world. The rest of the acronym, the trans and the intersex, and also potentially the ally, I identify them in the gender spectrum. And I know there's another section coming up on gender, so we won't go too much into that. But there is a difference, and unfortunately, when we lump it all together, sometimes we miss the different dimensions within LGBTIA. But as it relates to these companies and what companies are doing around the world, the first and foremost piece that we want to chat about today is the idea that being out in the workplace matters. And the number one reason that LGBTQIA employees come out at work is knowing that their colleagues would be supportive. And that's the definition of an ally. An ally is someone who uses the power that they have in an organization as someone of the majority population generally to help those, whether it be LGBTQIA, African American, Hispanic, using that power dynamic to help them in their daily work so that they can be themselves. There's an aspect called covering that also enters into this. So there's a difference between coming out, which is revealing your sexual orientation or gender identity, and actually covering. And the idea of covering is that you are hiding an aspect of your identity in the workplace. And unfortunately, covering impacts roughly 95% of employees. Everyone covers some aspect of their identity to fit into the norm, to feel like they're a part of a group. In the LGBTQ space, it tends to focus on people's personal lives, their relationships, their background. And if you think about it from a productivity perspective, covering or hiding an aspect of your identity is one of the most dangerous things employees can do. And it's something that companies all around the world are focusing on eliminating. So today we're going to have a brief conversation with my colleague Alex from Dow. And I'm going to ask Alex to share his story of coming out. And we're going to talk a little bit about allies and the need for allies in the manufacturing association world. Because there are stereotypes, of course, of industries, of companies, of leaders. And I want to just kind of dig in a little bit to his personal story, and then we'll talk about how you as leaders in the industry can take away some of these learnings for your own individual industries. So with that, Alex, thank you for being here. Welcome. And I'd love you just to start with a little bit of your background. Tell us a little bit about your story and coming out at Dow.
Sure. Thanks, Todd and AJ. Appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit about myself. So again, my name is Alex Papistrat. I'm an operations leader for Dow, located in Houston, Texas. And I've been with Dow for about 10 years. So just a little bit about myself. Originally, I grew up in upstate New York in a small rural town. And I came out at a very early age. I was about 14 years old when I came out. And you can imagine that's a pretty difficult feat with not many resources around. And actually, when the first person I came out to didn't accept me, my friend David. And really didn't talk to me until my senior year. So pretty traumatic for a 14-year-old kid. But I was very fortunate to have, loving and inclusive parents whom are my best allies today. And so, that helped me get through my high school years. I went to the University of Rochester in upstate New York and graduated with chemical engineering and was looking for jobs. So this was like 2011. And I remember when I was looking for jobs, I was trying to figure out what companies might be good to work at, especially in a manufacturing environment. And so I used the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index as kind of a measure of what companies might be good for me to work for. And so Dow had received 100% ranking from them. So it was one of the companies I was very interested in looking at. So I started at Dow in 2011. I was fortunate, moved down to New Orleans area. Again, working in a rural manufacturing area. Also, was fortunate to be living in New Orleans, so there's some more resources there for LGBT. But I was probably the first person that was ever out in manufacturing in my plant. So that was a challenge not only for myself, right? Moving to a new area, but also for the folks that had never really interacted with an LGBT person before. And I found it very important to be authentic in the workplace. And what I'd say is, over time, being authentic, you start to teach other people about how to be allies, and people kind of come out of the woodwork, I would say, in manufacturing. There are some challenges, right? There were some folks that probably weren't the most inclusive or accepting, but I worked through that and had crucial conversations, candid conversations with them. But I was fortunate that Dow, overall is a very, supportive a company for LGBT employees and, the inclusion topics in general. And we can talk a little bit more about that.
So I want to go back to a couple of things that you said, though. One, about coming out. I think too often people don't understand that coming out is a constant process. So you came out when you were 14, but every single interaction that you have at work and a plant around the world, you have to come out again, or you have the opportunity to come out again. And I think that's something that not a lot of people know. They think you came out when you were 14 and you're gay, versus every room you walk into, you are assumed to be straight until you reveal your sexual orientation, which I think is something interesting and an opportunity that LGBTQ people have. It makes us much more empathetic leaders, because we literally walk into a room and have to read the room for safety. And that's something that, as an LGBTQ leader working in Louisiana potentially, that was a navigation for you, I would imagine. Can you talk a little bit about coming out at Dow? So you looked at the Human Rights Campaign ranking and score, which, if you don't know the Human Rights Campaign, they're the largest LGBTQ organization in the country, and they rank companies on their LGBTQ friendliness. So Dow has a 100% score on that ranking, which is really quite a feat and something that took a lot of work for a lot of companies. So you interview with Dow. Are you out in your interview? Are you out your first day? Do you sort of feel your way along? Tell us a little bit about what it was like to come into manufacturing as a gay man.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even when you're applying for jobs, right, you're trying to figure out what you put on your resume. So I came out on my resume because I had the fact that I ran our Pride network at the University of Rochester. So it was another reason I wanted to, apply to companies that had that positive LGBT ranking. And, it's a demonstration of my leadership, right? It's not necessarily an extracurricular that I ran the program at the University of Rochester. So in my interview itself, it was definitely more of a technical interview. I mean, they had my resume and everything, but we didn't necessarily talk about it specifically in the interview itself. But I would say when after the interview, I met with a hiring manager from HR, and, she brought it up. She's like, so I see you have some leadership skills, running the Pride network at the University of Rochester. Can you talk about it? And that opened up the discussion about the GLAD network, which is our LGBT organization at Dow. And, a very candid discussion about, what it's like working in manufacturing, what the resources we have available to the employees. And then again, on my first day at Dow, I had, went up to lunch with the department, and there were two, I didn't know it at the time, two very supportive allies in my group, one of which led the LGBT group for my site. And then the other had brought up while we were at lunch, the Pride Parade that we have in New Orleans and things like that. So they definitely, they basically, it was a sigh of relief to have. I didn't have to do it, right? They kind of offered me that olive branch, like, hey, we're so super supportive. We have this network. And that was, really laid the foundation for me to feel comfortable coming out at work. But as you mentioned, it is a daily process. We recently had a business update meeting the other day, and I had the opportunity to give the inclusion moment and told a similar story as we did today, and came out to over 1,000 Dow people within my business. So it's a constant process.
Well, and so I want to highlight a couple of things there. One, let's talk about the allies coming out to you. I work with CEOs all around the world. Out Leadership has about 650 CEOs we work with, including Jim Fitterling, the CEO of Dow, on exactly this topic, on how they can be allies. And Jim obviously sits in an interesting seat, especially as it relates to the Manufacturers Association, but also as an openly gay CEO, his allyship to the company, coming out himself to, I think, 45,000 employees at one point in one fell swoop, was a huge piece of leadership. And I think that role modeling and signaling at the top helps create a culture that enables people to be allies and to be out. But I want to sort of key in on what your ally friends did, which was that they did come out to you as allies. And I think that's also something that people need to realize. There's a thing in the LGBT community called the assumption of negative intent, which means that if you don't say something positive or sort of frame your allyship, unfortunately, LGBTQ people will assume something negative. Up until June of this year, for example, in the United States, you could legally be fired in 29 states, including Louisiana, for simply being gay, or 34 states for being transgender. And the Bostock decision from the Supreme Court supposedly eradicated that, but it's going to take many years until that actually makes its way into practice and in law across the states. So LGBTQ people are significantly at a disadvantage in a lot of different places across the country. And so the opportunity for allies to come out is significant. So I want to sort of go into that a little bit more deeply. So Alex, in terms of Dow and the manufacturing industry, so let's broaden it away from just Dow and how you sort of see the industry. I know that there are, of course, stereotypes of the industry of many different stripes. But from an outside perspective, working with the industry just a little bit, it seems like a lot of those, not necessarily myths, but perceptions of the industry not being as friendly to diversity or not being as friendly to LGBTQ folks are actually unfounded. And it sounds like your experience has proven that as well. I'd love you to talk a little bit about Dow's role in the manufacturing industry and maybe a little bit of the advocacy, because I've been so impressed by what Dow has done as it relates even to Louisiana when there was advocacy to Bobby Jindal to not pass the anti-LGBT legislation, and Dow, as the second largest employer in Louisiana, was able to use the economic power that the company has to really advocate for change. Talk a little bit about what your role has been internally and how you sort of see that in the manufacturing industry, if you can.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that, bringing that up. You know, I think that Dow in general is an ally to, you know, LGBT and all minority groups. And an example of that, like you mentioned, is the Supreme Court ruling on employment most recently. You know, Dow was signed on to the amicus brief for that, right? Dow continues to support legislation, not only at the local level in a state, but also the, you know, HRC Federal Equality Act. You were one of the first few employers to sign on to that. Now we have over hundreds, including the endorsement of the National Association of Manufacturers for that legislation. But, you know, leadership starts from the top. And I think Jim set the...
Talk a little bit about that. What does that mean? What is that legislation? For those who don't know, tell us, you know, the Equality Act, what would that do for us?
Yeah, so not only in employment, but the Federal Equality Act opens up Title VII protections for LGBT, you know, in housing, credit, employment, and a whole host of other areas as well, which is much needed legislation. And it eliminates, like you mentioned, the state-based approach, you know, having to have different laws in each state, and the company has to, you know, basically work with each state and figure out what we're going to do, what's acceptable here, what's not acceptable there. So it's not only positive for the employees because there's federal protection, but also for the company to be able to navigate, you know, what's acceptable in each area.
So I want to follow on to that. The last kind of chunk of time I'd love us to spend is really about what the leaders and the companies that are watching today can do. And I'd share one resource as a starting point, and it sort of ties to what you were mentioning, Alex. Out Leadership for the last 2 years has created what we call our LGBTQ Business Climate Index. And it actually ranks all 50 US states across 20 publicly identifiable data points around LGBT inclusion. So some of the pieces that Alex mentioned, including the pieces that are not covered by federal protection currently, and hopefully will be at some point, are itemized in that index. And then there's a ranking based on that index. And then there's a CEO business brief that has been created for each state. So there was the Louisiana brief, there's a Michigan brief, there's a Georgia brief, a North Carolina brief. All 50 US states have a brief for business leaders doing business in that state, walking them through how discrimination impacts their business, talent mobility, and ultimately what we want leaders to do. So one of the final things we wanted to chat about were just some specific opportunities and ideas that companies can implement following this talk. One of the key things that I'd like to recommend is that companies consider self-identification for LGBTQ employees. And that is the opportunity for employees to tell you who they are within your HR systems, within your employee engagement surveys, and across your populations. Leadership has a piece of research that we published last year that will help you do that, and we'll make sure to share that with you. But if you don't know who your LGBT employees are, it's hard to help them, it's hard to give them the platform, and it's hard to drive inclusion. So I highly recommend that companies consider it. Now, I know Dow has a couple of key programs that they've built as well, and I wanted Alex to share a couple of those best practices with us in closing as well. So Alex, talk to us a little bit about destination inclusion and a couple of the other initiatives that Dow has built.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, and from a corporate perspective, we've had employee resource groups for a while, but we really want to focus in on manufacturing and see how we can improve the inclusion efforts at the shop floor as well. So one of the things that Dow is going to be doing in the future is implementing our new leadership expectations around inclusion integrated into our operating discipline management systems. So this is basically the backbone and the structure for manufacturing at Dow. And we're doing a lot of different programs to really help with that effort, one of which is, as mentioned, is the destination inclusion. And really that's a program set similar to an ERG where we have a different structure for different leaders in the company. These are going to be regional leaders for the inclusion topics in manufacturing specifically. Starting from the top, requiring global leaders and senior leaders to be part of an ERG. That's really the top priority of the company, and we're looking to implement that soon. Once we have that, we're going to be focusing on shop floor discussions. So we're going to be having quarterly inclusion topics. We're in trainings where we actually do case studies of, maybe something that happened in the company through HR. And those are going to be conversations that are held at the shop floor. So in my example, I'm an operations leader. So I have 25 operators that report to me. And so every quarter, I'm going to be having a one-on-one meeting with my operators, the group, and, bringing up those case studies and empowering them to, build that muscle memory in terms of how they can respond to different situations, be aware of different situations that exist, not just for LGBT, but other minorities as well, whether it's females in the workplace, African Americans, or another diversity aspect like that.
That's perfect. Thank you, Alex. I think there are a lot of hopeful nuggets that folks have picked up from this, and I know we'll be able to share some of these resources with you afterwards. So with that, I'd like to thank the Manufacturing Institute for giving us this platform, and I look forward to continuing these conversations as each of you, as leaders in your companies, push the conversation of LGBT inclusion forward.